It was awe-inspiring to be able to be here on the anniversary of the founding of Exim Bank. Exim was founded on February 2nd, 1934. It's when President Roosevelt signed the executive order, and to be here with his great-granddaughter, Sarah Bottinger, also special. The director here had a chance to walk us through the library, to see his presidential office, then to end the conversation with dialogue with his great granddaughter, and right before having the historian show us the letters, show us the reports, show us the notes of the president. I mean, I'm excited. Couldn't ask for something. I mean,
It's just been the original documents, what was in great grandfather's mind, thinking of them, proud, especially proud of them. Huge things. But he was also so that it's going to be a really important institution in the coming decades.
We really appreciate the opportunity for all of you to be here with us, and we know this is a very busy week. And so, as I said, we're going to jump right in. We really appreciate the director here and the president here at Hunter College for allowing XM to come to be with us. It's so generous of the Roosevelt House for us to be able to have this special occasion and to celebrate this special occasion and to be here for this special event. And so we've titled this as Fostering Global Competitiveness, XM at 90, and Shaping the Future. So someone said to me, well, how many of these 90th events are you going to have? And, and I said, we're going to have as many as we can, because it is not about just celebrating what was founded in 1934. It's really about how we move forward into the future. And so many of you who are in this room today are the ones who have really been helping us make the move into the 21st century as we continue to mount and defend, I'll say the word, defend our relevancy. And so we are excited, I'm excited to be here with two directors. I'm going to ask them to stand. Let's give them a round of applause. Our Vice Chair, Judith Pryor, and our Director, Congressman Backus. And then, you know, it's always a pleasure when we are having to have someone who served as a former chair, and that's Fred Hochberg. Let's have him please stand for a few minutes. As you can imagine, Fred and I have regular conversations about the running of Exim Bank and the work that we're doing for the future. You know, this program is going to be moderated today by Eric Gettler, who's the executive chair of the U.S. News and World Report. So you're going to be hearing from him, just like you're going to be hearing from Bob Steele and Roy McGuire and Karen Tambor for agreeing to be on the panel. But more importantly, you're going to be hearing directly from one of our own great governors, Ned Lamont, right here. Let's give him and all of them a round of applause for what's to come. You know, we're proud to have celebrated our 90th anniversary. And in 1934, as you saw from the film, our agency was created by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He dared to dream the dream of a different future, a future that bets on the United States and the full faith and credit of the U.S. business, American workers, and just importantly, our partners around the world. And we think it is the same bet that President Joe Biden and Vice President Harris has done over these many years. You know, on a personal note, it was a proud moment to be at the in Hyde Park at the Presidential Library, to be there with President Roosevelt's great-granddaughter, Sarah Bottinger. we toured and we had the opportunity to see firsthand and to look then and to look now at the special strides that XM has done each and every day to honor the heritage and fulfill the mission of supporting American jobs by facilitating U.S. exports. You know, we take pride in our abilities to support small businesses across the nation. And in fact, it is important to recognize that nearly 90% of the total number of XM's authorizations directly benefit U.S. small business. And we're also particularly pleased to know there's another anniversary at XM, the 25th anniversary of our minority and women-owned business. You know, all of you are going to hear a lot about XM today, but a lot of you in this room already know about XM today. And so I want you to keep your ears keen for conversations that will be taking place, especially around new domestic financing tools that we have, such as Make More in America. It is an initiative that is going to be, we hope, to help revitalize American manufacturing, and it will improve the resiliency of our supply chains while leveling the playing fields for American companies competing in overseas markets. And so for 90 years and 90 years to come, we have steadfastly supported U.S. business as they export their American-made goods and services around the globe. So I am very pleased to be able to ask and welcome our esteemed guests, special guest, Governor Ned Lamont, who has been leading the great state for his keynote remarks about all of the work that he has been doing, not only in his state, but with other governors and other leaders, federal, state, and local, around economic opportunity. Thanks so much. Governor.
Well, thanks, Rita. I can say you don't need somebody defending the XM Bank. You've got 50 governors who are big champions for the XM Bank and what it means to our states. And I really appreciate you inviting a guy from Connecticut here, although I feel right at home. Fred's my neighbor there. Bob's my neighbor there. Are you my neighbor there? From Bridgewater. Karen, thank you. Anybody else from Connecticut? I got to know where the voters are. Okay, that's good for me. Just paying attention. I want to say, just a personal note, my uncle, named John McCumber, was president of the XM Bank under George Herbert Walker Bush. So I've had a certain understanding of the importance of XM Bank, how proud he was. He passed away earlier this year, but I appreciate being here and being able to say how important it was. He pointed out, the origins of the bank. I mean, 1934, 90 years ago, as you point out. Remember, 4 years earlier was the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And not the cause of the Depression, but it certainly didn't help. And, by 1934, as you probably know, world trade had shrunk about 70%. And I think Franklin Roosevelt knew how important it was when it comes to jobs and the world economy, do everything we can for world trade, in particular exports, and protecting what we got to grow here in our country. And talking to Fred, I know a little bit how you've evolved. I know what it means in terms of, in particular, the emphasis upon small business and maybe some industrial planning going on. I'm a little shaky about industrial planning, but I'll tell you what it means as I think about our state of Connecticut and how XM would play in. We're a state that was really flat as a pancake for 50 years. We didn't really add any new jobs. Young people were leaving. And our idea of an industrial strategy was to see if we could give really big incentives, AKA bribes, to see if we can get big companies to move to the state of Connecticut. And, some came, but overall we were losing employment, and it was not a winning strategy. And that was very much reinforced like a punch to the nose when General Electric left. And General Electric left, and I did a little research on what was going on. You would have thought maybe they left because of taxes. Well, you don't leave Connecticut for Massachusetts due to taxes, and frankly, GE doesn't pay any taxes so to the state. But I talked a fair amount, and it was workforce, the inability to recruit the best and brightest to a leafy suburb in Fairfield, Connecticut. It was lack of a good airport, because in and out was very important. We were considered a bit of a cul-de-sac. And it was just a sense that there was government and business, and two worlds did not talk. So as governor, I tried to address each of those, in their order. We had a little airport called Tweed Airport, New Haven, that had one destination. Now it's got 41 destinations, and opening up that section as well as Bradley Airport. We created a group called Advanced CT, where our business and our government work together collaboratively as a partnership, a little closer maybe to some of the European model. And most importantly was workforce. If we can't attract and recruit the best people, those businesses are going to go someplace else. And every state's got to think about what their strategic advantage is. If I was Florida, I can sell sunshine to tourists, and you look pretty good. That's not bad, but that's not my strength. Texas, you sell oil and gas, and you're a genius. Connecticut has always prided itself on a really highly trained, productive workforce, and the world is getting much more competitive. So that was probably the most important change we've had, to do everything we can to attract young people, keep young people in our state. And for the first time in a long time, we have more people moving into our state than otherwise, young people there. Do everything I can to keep, we have a pretty good higher ed system, by the way. I want more of those people staying in the state of Connecticut. So we said, look, you graduate from a Connecticut college, take a job with a Connecticut business, and we'll forgive your student loan over 4 or 5 years. Just one more reason for businesses to hire local, and for businesses to and for students to stay local. And so we moved away from trying to attract all those big businesses with bribes and doing much more trying to do everything we can to change the ecosystem, make it easier to start up new businesses. And there we've had more new business startups in the last 3 years than ever before in the history of the state. And just as importantly, more businesses started by women and people of color than ever before. And what I'm trying to do is do everything I can to expand those opportunities. And Rita, I think I want XM not to do less. I want XM to do more. I'd like to see you in every single economic development office in all 50 states, but make Connecticut the first. Our small businesses really need what Export-Import Bank provides. I don't know what the import part is anyway. I'm really focused on the export part, and it's jobs and exports. And, because these are small businesses, they need an on-ramp to European expansion. They need an on-ramp to the rest of the world. We need those relationships. Maybe the State Department helps. Our economic development team can help. And in terms of financing, they just don't know exactly if they can get the loans they need in order to be able to expand. And that's what XM does. I think it's absolutely invaluable. Every single state right now is looking around the world. I don't really compete with New York. New York's success is Connecticut's success. Massachusetts' success is Connecticut's success. But we are looking around the world as we try and figure out how we grow and expand. Connecticut is a big export state. We do about $16 billion a year. And you maybe think it's all Sikorsky and bigger companies. That's not true. We have 5,000 companies in our little state that export. And those are the ones that we try and make sure they have the right entrees to the rest of the world. And thanks to the Export-Import Bank, make sure they have the financing that gives them the foundation that allows them to do this. So, Rita, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and to tell that story. I know you've got a great panel coming up. Some really good Connecticut people, and Ray wishes he was in Connecticut. Thanks, everybody.
Let's give the governor one more round of applause. Governor, we really appreciate you very, very much. Now we're going to call up the panel, and I'm going to let Eric take over as the Executive Vice Chair of U.S. News and World Report to introduce our panel. Thank you so much.
I'm going to have the panel come up and join us. And first of all, Governor, thank you for all your public service. Thank you for the great work you're doing and I hope Connecticut continues to do well. But as a former state and city economic official, I hope you just do just a little bit not as good as New York, but really well. Number two. As I said, my name is Eric Gertler. I'm the Executive Chairman and CEO of U.S. News and World Report. I am also a founding member of the FOR Club, the Friends of Rita Jo Lewis. So it's a delight to be here. I want to wish XM Bank a happy 90th and toast you as you help to shape the future of all states, including Connecticut. We have a great panel here. Before I introduce the panel, obviously the topic of global competitiveness and exports and imports, and how government, industry, and the financial sector can collaborate and drive the evolution of technologies that transform the world today is critical. Down the road, not too far from here, the UN is talking about sustainable economies and how we do that and how that shapes future generations. And that's really an important topic. It's my pleasure to be able to moderate this conversation. Let me just do very quick introductions, and then we're going to jump right into the panel. So on my far left, I have Bob Steele, who's a partner and vice chair at Perella Weinberg. But Bob has also previously been deputy mayor for economic development, at which I had the pleasure and privilege of serving for Bob when he was deputy mayor under Mayor Bloomberg. He was CEO of Wachovia, and he was also undersecretary for domestic finance at the Treasury Department and head of global equities and vice chair of Goldman Sachs. And then in the middle, Karen Cornell-Tambour is the co-chief investment officer at Bridgewater and leads the firm's sustainable investing efforts. She was previously head of Bridgewater's investment research, leading a team that devised the global trading strategies. She is a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and is a perennial on Barron's list of most influential women in U.S. finance. And then lastly, to my left, is Ray McGuire, who is the president of the asset management firm Lazard. Previously, he was vice chair at Citigroup, chairman of Citi's banking, capital markets, and advisory business. But he has also served at the highest levels at Morgan Stanley, at Merrill Lynch, Wasserstein Perella, and personally over his career has advised on over $750 billion in transactions. So as you can see, we have an incredibly qualified panel here. My job is to be the conductor and let them do all the discussion. And I want to start off with a general question to each of the panelists. And I'm going to start with Bob. You know, we see a lot of instability in the world today, and I'd love for you to assess the global economy in the face of that instability, and what pressures are you seeing on the world economy and the U.S. economy? And I'm going to go down the line on that question to start it off. So thank you to all of you, and thank you, Bob, for being here.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric. And before we start, I know I speak for all of the three of us and say congratulations to the XM Bank. It's great to be here to honor you, Chairman, and also former Chairman Hochberg. And I think it's also special to imagine where we are at Roosevelt House, given the fact that President Roosevelt was the one who had the courage to look down the road and imagine how important trade could be and how it was really crucial to think about that. So it's great to be here. You know, I guess I'm a bit intimidated to start with that question because of the fellow panelists. But I think that, you know, if you kind of close your eyes, in the last couple of decades, we've had two major events. One was the global financial crisis and then the pandemic. And these were both real punches in the stomach to global economies. You might argue that the first was self-inflicted, where we created that ourselves by some poor choices, but we didn't create the pandemic. And so I think we have to give policymakers and central bankers a lot of credit in their response to both of these situations, which were really quite challenging. I think that I was working in Washington at the time of the global financial crisis, and you know, we imagine economic contractions and we think of them in the broad sense, but economic contractions are quite regressive, and we really have to think about the effect on our fellow citizens, especially those who are less well off. and I would give policymakers and central bankers high marks for how they responded to both of these. But here we are much later, and I think we're kind of coming out of the most recent of the pandemic, and it's a bit uncertain, and it's also uneven. I think that in the United States that there are a lot of attractive characteristics to the current economy, and it feels as though we have some wind in our sails to work through these things. And other parts of the world, it doesn't feel that way. I had a meeting this morning with someone from Germany, and listening to the state of play in Europe, you were not as optimistic that we had the right signs. I think that we're going through a reset, and then I'll stop, in financial markets, as it seems as though we've reached an inflection point on the tightening, which was to attack inflation. And now we'll see how that transition goes as we move into a more normalized thing. I personally would be pretty optimistic for the United States, that we feel like the delta or the relative position is stronger than other places. And so I think that would be my pause, would be we've had two shocks. We've worked through those. I give policymakers high marks for how they responded. And now we're finding the new normal as we come to the reset, optimistic on the United States. I think there are cautions other places.
First, let me thank you also for having us here. This is really great and honored to be here. I think that I agree with much of what Bob said. I think 2020 was a turning point to a different type of economic environment than what we saw prior to COVID. And that if you look at the nature of the spending, what's keeping the economy up, I'd call it a few meaningful differences. One is that I'd argue as much as the 40 years coming up to 2020, a lot of what was spent was inherently deflationary. Even though you spent it, it was actually spent to take cost out of the system. And so you spent to get cheaper labor abroad, or you spent to automate what you're doing. And today, a lot of spending is, at least in the short term, quite inflationary, because you're not spending to go and send a cost and be cheaper. You're actually spending because you want a more resilient supply chain. You're worried about that instability you were talking about, Eric, and the geopolitical events. You're spending because you're trying to remake your industrial base for a new energy order. And you're spending in ways that kind of raise the costs. The one most deflationary thing we have is the potential of where AI is going to take us. But in the near term, it's not hitting the economy today. Immediately, what we need is to spend lots in order to power the ability to do it. The second thing that's different about that spending is that it's much less literally responsive to demand. Some businesses, of course, are still, building what they're building in response to demand they're seeing. But a lot of spending is actually pretty impervious to what households do. It's either coming from, the government is just playing a bigger role, I think appropriately. I'm sure we'll speak more about China and its strategy. But that means that there's money like IRA money that is sort of pushing what the United States priority should be, regardless of literally what end demand is. And what you have happening with things like AI is spending that feels existential. It doesn't matter what demand you're seeing at the other end. You feel like you need to spend it now. And then the third big difference, I'd say, is that you have spending going on that for the first time in many decades is more or less not really powered by borrowing. I mean, we've gotten, leading up to the financial crisis, pretty addicted to, once you're kind of far into an expansion, you're spending by borrowing. And now most of the spending is people sitting on pretty nice balance sheets, much better business balance sheets, much better household wealth. The only entity that has a poor balance sheet is, to some extent, federal government, which can handle that. And happy to talk more about that as well. And so in the context of then a fourth big factor, which is China pursuing a pretty aggressive, very different strategy, very deflationary, pushing a lot of things onto world markets, you're talking about an economy that has a lot kind of self-powering it. People who are going to spend even when there's a little bit of a slowdown. People who are spending because it's existential. People who are spending for geopolitical reasons. In the same context Bob was talking about of the Federal Reserve starting to ease. So that's a lot cushioning us to kind of keep going and be able to move forward in the face of a lot of instability, and even use the instability to power the economy ahead and get more spending in the system rather than the other way.
And Ray, you want to add to that?
Yeah, let me add to that. First of all, thank you for having us. And Fred, it's great to see you and acknowledge your leadership of EXIM. And Madam Reno-Jo, it is really wonderful to see you, especially on this 90th anniversary of the EXIM Bank. I look at this through the lens of geoeconomics and geopolitics. And notwithstanding the fracturing that is taking place in this country, if I think about where the world is, the U.S. remains the epicenter all eyes are now looking to the U.S., and I'm going to acknowledge where we are with respect to China, but economically and politically, the world is looking at the U.S. for a maintenance of leadership that we have displayed historically that is now coming under some pressure. But in order for the world to move forward, in order for this country to move forward, the U.S. has to prevail. Bob referenced what took place from the great financial crisis, and he also referenced the pandemic. What the pandemic did was highlight the exposure that we have, notwithstanding how great we are. It highlighted the exposure that we had to supply chain and how it is that this country will remain competitive. And an example that I will give you is one which you all know quite well, which is chips. Recognizing that 90% of the chips that we consume are made outside of the country. Nothing that had to do with chips, including cars, was available to us during the pandemic. The reliance that we have on chips remains. In June of 1979, the U.S. peaked when it comes to manufacturing. We went to a lower cost manufacturing that generated higher returns, so it was more productivity. Today, we still have that exposure. As I think about where we are economically and political, and let me frame this so that it is very real and practical. The largest investments that we have made to date, CHIPS Act, infrastructure. Infrastructure, the largest recipient of infrastructure, will take place between New York and New Jersey. $16 billion, 72,000 jobs, called Gateway. The most important investment that we've made in this country, where we happen a few miles away from here, which is the CHIPS Act. Micron, $100 billion, 2.4 million square feet, for us to become competitive when it comes to making high-end semiconductor chips. That kind of investment reduces the exposure when it comes to chips. It'll go from us manufacturing 10% to 14 or 15%. So as we think about where we are in our dependence on our own capabilities, it comes down to talent. It comes down to making certain that we continue to invest in the fundamentals so that we'll reduce that supply chain exposure, which is material today, which I think this administration has acknowledged and is going and making steps on a bipartisan basis to invest in this country. What is that ultimately going to result in? It's going to result in jobs. It's going to take jobs, manufacturing jobs. We don't think so much about the importance of plumbers and electricians as we go through energy transition, as we go through generative AI. Fundamental to both of those is going to be what happens to the labor force and how we invest in that labor force, not only the plumbers and electricians, but the engineers. And so the reference that Ned made, the governor made, to talent in Connecticut, it resides in New York also. It needs necessarily to reside in New York to make certain that the high-end chips continue to get manufactured or will get manufactured. So we can't find ourselves at a more pivotal moment in our history. We've said that historically, but now is a moment, given what's taking place both geoeconomically and geopolitically.
Let's continue on what you talked about. Bob, when we think about chips, we've got, Micron in upstate New York, you've got Intel in Ohio, you've got Samsung, Taiwan Semiconductor in Arizona and Texas. We're seeing different results. How would you assess the government's efforts in building that infrastructure, and how does that play a role in sort of the global economy?
Well, it's an interesting situation. I think it's been informative to me. I've changed some of my perspective, to be honest. You learn things and you think you know kind of the answer, and you learn over time that things are a little more complicated than you imagine, and maybe you need to re-examine some of the things you were considering. I don't start out as a natural affiliator with planning of the economy. My instinct is that government should provide rails or infrastructure, and then we should see who competes and wins that way. And so, to be honest, the CHIPS Act was a bit more of a thumb on the scale to allocate into specific companies than was my instinct, to be honest. But I'm for the CHIPS Act as part of your learning through this. And now what we have, if you think about it, is government is facilitating capital. Because if you remember, what we learned was that there was a subsidy around the world for the manufacturing of chips. And the reality was, for us to be competitive, we had to provide something like that subsidy. And it's a bit uncomfortable to me, to be honest, with my religiosity, but I've come to believe it's the right thing. But it requires a delicate balance, and you're going to lead us in the future, but this is what I think of as a public-private partnership idea that we're going to talk about. And it is right for government, and I think the thing that Ray spoke about, and I'm always learning from Ray, but this is the latest example, is that we realized that we had an economic vulnerability that the free markets had exposed, and all of a sudden, all the chips are made overseas because they were the best place, but then when there was a problem, then we were really hamstrung, and it put us in a greater risk than we wanted. So I think getting comfortable with this idea, and as I said, my instinct might have been like, gee, do we need to do this? And now my hand is kind of saying this is the right thing to do, which is an example of even at my older age, you can learn new things. And so that would be my reaction to it.
I'm going to come back to Ray. I mean, Bob just talked about public-private partnerships and collaborations, and you talk about how the United States is the center for sort of geoeconomic and geopolitical thinking in the world. So we've required a public-private partnership to bring chips back here. How do you view those public-private partnerships? How important are those as you look at the economy and the global economy going forward?
They are essential. And so we've invested through that maybe $50 billion, and the private side has invested 400 and some odd billion dollars. Yes, we get the incentives, but if I look at the competition, last week before last, we saw the convening in between China and Africa. 70 to 90% of the critical minerals necessary for energy transition are resourced in Africa. Our relationship to those sources is limited. We need to have public-private partnerships in order to access that. Otherwise, our exposure, the risk to our ability to remain competitive in the league is higher. And we need public-private partnerships to withstand that or to meet that risk and to continue to prevail. So the answer is yes, and I get the reluctance that was there, but we're in the middle of a competition. Right? We've historically taken for granted that we're going to lead. There are others out there now who have taken a different lens and looking at this through a different lens, and we recognize the exposure to the things that are most important to us. Generative AI. What do you need there? You need water, you need electricity, you need talent. Energy transition, you need precious minerals to go through energy transition. Just look at those two fundamental theses that are going to go through our and our children's lifetime. We don't invest today, when those of us who will become grandparents and those of us who have children, we're investing for their future. Otherwise, the risk is much too high. We have to have those public-private partnerships. They're essential to our competitiveness.
Karen, you spent a lot of time thinking about China's investments, particularly with respect to minerals. How do you view China's efforts to corner the market, particularly in Africa? How do we counter that? How do you think that affects the United States in the global economy going forward?
Well, I think the biggest thing, and it really relates to the mind shift that both my co-panelists are talking about, is we have to understand what their strategy is to get our head around what it'll take to counter it, right? And it's so foreign to us. The way they're behaving is just so far from what we would do. And so they have a very large economy that is extremely weak right now, meaning people don't want to buy anything. And instead of going in and doing what we did in the crises that Bob spoke about, right, the great financial crisis, COVID, and trying to help those households, trying to say households can't buy anything, households have no confidence, let's help them, they're literally doing the opposite. They're saying, I don't care about that. What I've decided is I need to win on these 10 sectors. And they have a literal list, whether it's AI, new energy transition, they have a list. And they're saying, I'm going to make sure that we produce as much as possible those materials, those products, whatever they are, even if there's no buyer. Because we'll do it. We'll do it for free, we'll do it at a loss, and we'll just flood the world with it, because that's the way that we'll end up kind of being the leader in that space. And we are just not ready and prepared without the kind of shifts we're making, things like these public-private partnerships, to handle that. We're set up for a world where everyone sort of does their competitive advantage. We're not set up for an adversary that's willing to take it at a loss, to do it way more than they have demand for, and to just prioritize kind of flooding the world with it. And so that puts us in a spot where that mentality shift that Bob spoke about, I mean, this is many decades of orthodoxy we had for the world that the United States created, where we said the government shouldn't be involved, and there were mostly bad examples of the government getting involved. I think we're figuring out that, wait a minute, we don't just want a strong economy, we do care about the composition of what is in that economy, especially if, like Ray said, we have vulnerabilities, and there's spots that we're gonna be vulnerable. So what that means is, we gotta be able to come and just have a bigger role for government to play to say, these things are important, these are vulnerabilities I won't live with. And if the person on the other side is willing to do it at a loss and flood the market, I got to do something. And I could do it defensively, like put up walls, put up tariffs, say you can't have your stuff come in. But I also got to do it offensively, like make sure I'm actually going out there. And if I need a mineral, who else has it? How can I partner with them? How can I be in the middle of the supply chain rather than just putting up walls, build my own capabilities?
So Bob, we talked about your religiosity before. Does that same thing apply to artificial intelligence? Do you still think that there, or should, in this case, should we have more public-private partnerships on artificial intelligence as we're looking forward in the same way we've thought about the CHIPS Act? Or is it just a matter of the private sector in a situation where China is deeply investing in some of those sectors?
Yeah, I don't consider myself an expert, Eric, but my instinct is that the value creation and the impact of artificial intelligence will be better managed independently from the private sector than the public sector. I have a lot of confidence in the creativity of the talent focused on this in the United States. But I'm not an expert, but that's my instinct. And I think we should be supportive. There's some things that are a bit bothersome. You know, we have rules and mores with regard to how we share information and how we think of the individual. And it's imaginable to me that certain more controlled economies might have advantages in developing certain benefits of artificial intelligence than we might have. And I don't have a resolution of that, but I recognize the tension that if in China, they want to have access to all kinds of medical information more easily than we might organize that in a more centralized way. They might have some benefit in their learning, but I don't know how to square that circle. But I'm recognizing what I think is a dynamic that I'm not sure. But I have a lot of confidence that this is an area where our universities, our institutes, and our knowledge will let us win. And that it's not a cost-driven activity, whereas other things that Karen was referring to, you have a cost advantage and you could kind of muscle your way through it. I don't think this is a muscle. I think this is a bit more nuanced. I don't know if my panelists, you would know more than me, and I'd be curious, Karen, your reaction to how I described it.
I think many of our adversaries would agree that what's happening in AI, we're so ahead in the talent and the thinking that they don't know exactly what it takes to catch up. And that's why you're seeing, for example, the French response saying, wait, if we are the only other country outside the United States that has an AI powerhouse, we better protect that. That's a gem we can't just pay for somewhere else.
So Ray, as someone...
I'm sure we're ahead, but others are quickly pacing. So I would take nothing. Again, there's a competition out there. And so we need to be mindful of the competition. Remember, as you cited, or part of the background is the World Economic Forum. In 2016, 2017, Xi came to the stage and talked about globalization, codified 19-party Congress. He still is continuing to focus on globalization. We're focused on deglobalization. So that means we need to have partners amongst our allies that allow us to go and compete. Sorry.
Ray, as someone that has spent so much of your career doing global transactions, can you talk about the role of financial institutions in these deals, in these areas, as we go forward for the next 5 or 10 years?
Essential. The movement of, well, I say the essential in two ways. One, the way that we have traditionally thought about the movement of capital. And in my prior firm, which didn't have the 176-year-old history that my current firm has, they transacted $4 trillion a day, actively involved with XM to make certain that in the geographies that were a little challenging geographies, that we could still participate. That's in the traditional SWIFT system. The way that we need to continue to be involved in economic flows is in blockchain technology. And U.S. financial institutions today are the ones that are at the forefront of that. And we need to make certain that from a regulatory standpoint, they stay as sound as they can, and they continue to invest, because they are in many ways the infrastructure, the financial infrastructure for most of the world's corporations, in direct relationship and sometimes in concert with the XM Bank, who understands what's taking place geoeconomically and help facilitate a lot of the capital flows. So U.S. financial institutions, essential to how we continue to compete. Eyes and ears in many of those geographies, and in some geographies where, because of the rule of law and currency, the U.S. is not participating in that scale, many of those financial institutions can help facilitate flow so that we can become more involved.
You know, we have a few minutes left. I'm going to ask the same question to
Let me
both
just
Bob and
chime in.
Karen.
I just would say, I think that Ray's hitting a good point, that I've had two meetings this morning, one with people from Germany, the other from Japan, and they both talked about the U.S. asset of our very sophisticated and developed financial markets as providing the ability for companies and governments to succeed, and the variety of tools that we've developed in the United States. I'm not going to call it God's work. Someone else did that and got in trouble. But I think that, that the idea of all the different tools, whether it's securitization, strong depository institutions, private capital, alternative assets, these are tools that allow us to finance things in different ways with the help and supervision from a regulatory perspective of the government, and also with the tools of people like the XM Bank.
Karen, you want to jump in as a final word on the role that financial institutions need to play to make sure the United States and its industries remain competitive, and how it influences the global economy going forward?
I mean, look, if you level set, if you invested $1 in the US stock market in 2010, coming out of the financial crisis, your dollar is worth about $6. And if you invested it in most of our partners, competitors, anywhere else around the world, it's probably worth less than $2. So the difference is enormous. And these things really, they build on themselves, right? They build on themselves because money compounds. And so a little bit of a small difference every year, you could look after a decade and a half, investing in the United States has been massively more profitable. And when you break that down and say what that was, right? You can always talk about ingenuity of individual people, but there's a lot here in the system that companies are actually incentivized to use money to make a return on capital, not for other reasons, to prioritize shareholders, and to actually try to create profitability. And you see the struggle in a lot of places, whether it's Japan, whether it's parts of Europe, to create a system that'll do that. So keeping our financial system an ecosystem where companies actually have that air and water and breath, where they can actually do that and make investments that create that kind of return on capital, it's something that's the envy of the world, and it's created tremendous things, and keeping that is a top priority.
Well, it goes to show you that when you have three experts who are so deeply understanding of the global economy, we can get so much done in a short period of time. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it back to the chairwoman, Rita Jo Lewis. Thank you, and thank you to the panelists.
Let's give them another round of applause. We know we were going to have a very exciting and lively conversation today, and we say to our listening audience and our staff back in Washington, and then for the friends and allies that are in this room, you know, we are and we will continue to look to the future. XM is always, as you know, because many of you are helping us with that, seeking new and innovative ways to meet the needs of our customers. The thing that was so striking about this conversation is when you all talked about the intersection between geoeconomics and geopolitics. People asked, why is XM at the UN week this week? There have been conversations that we've already begun to have starting yesterday and today, that everything around countering the PRC, Africa, the Quad, talking about issues and industries like critical minerals and small business, of course, and then, of course, energy, semiconductors in Ukraine. This week, we are engaged in all of those conversations with so many leaders, but more importantly, we are engaged with clients and customers and friends and allies like some of you that are sitting in this room. So as we celebrate our 90th anniversary, we are enjoying reflecting on our rich legacy, but on behalf of the directors and myself, we want to be very clear to all. We are looking ahead to find ways to expand the options to strengthen our support so U.S. companies can not only compete successfully in the ever-changing global marketplace, but we need you to win. And for you to know that XM 90 years, as we move to the future, we still have your back. Thank you very much. And we will now invite you all up to a nice reception. Thank you very much. Can I get the panelists to